Hi, welcome to another Digital Media Literacy podcast. I'm Mrs. Meschter, librarian at Chinook Middle School.
And I'm Miss, oh, go ahead.
I'm Miss Gunn. I'm at Highline High School.
And I'm Miss SL at Sylvester Middle School.
So last week, we just kind of did like an introduction about what digital literacy, digital media literacy, digital citizenship, news literacy, what all those things are. So today, let's just dive into digital citizenship. So if we're thinking about digital citizenship. Last week, Ms. Gunn brought up that digital citizenship, if we take away digital, it's still citizenship. Like, how do we behave in a community? So what are our rights as members of a community and a digital community?
Access. That's always at the top of my list. We have the right to access, and that is still hotly debated, and that bothers me that that's still hotly debated, because digital community is real community, and we're all part of it now, whether we want to be or not. I don't know how many Luddites are, in our community, but our students as 21st century learners are definitely part of a digital citizenry. We're gonna have trouble with citizen and citizenship today, aren't we? But they need access.
Well, and I wonder if it's helpful. Yes, I agree with that. But I wonder if it's also helpful to think about what are examples of either physical communities that people are a part of as well as digital communities, just to wrap our brains around what that even means. So I think about when you're talking about community, what are communities that we are a part of? You could say, I'm part of my school community. You could say I'm part of my neighborhood community. You could say I'm part of a dance community because there's a place that I take dance classes in, right? My husband is a musician, and so he's part of a musicians community, right? We have these things in our lives that we are. And then thinking about how does that then translate into the digital world, right? School community right now is all digital, basically, but that maybe isn't normally the case. I'm on a listserv that's just for librarians from around the world, right? So that's a digital community that I'm a part of. I'm on Facebook, and so anybody who I'm friends with on Facebook is part of a digital community. So we have these different pockets. And I think it's good to identify what are the ones that we are in, even to be able to think then about rights and responsibilities, because that might look a little different from community to community, right?
But I guess my point about access comes to what you were saying, Ms. Gunn, in that the digital community is different in that it's multiple communities, or there are digital elements to different communities, but a lot of them have similar rights and responsibilities in the digital world. The I guess the digital component of it, where the actual what the digital community is focused on, for example, dance, that might have another set of rights and responsibilities. Does that make sense? So it's kind of,
so then what are some base level, regardless of what kind of digital community you're in, what are base level rights and responsibilities?
Well, if we start with rights, I mean, I already made a nod to access, but I think privacy is another important right in any digital community that you are a part of. You have certain expectations of privacy, and then you have certain expectations of not privacy, which is hard for a lot of people to understand. It's like you're not guaranteed privacy if you're using a public space, and the digital world is a public space in a lot of ways. So we could go into the details. We'll unpack that one later because there's a lot in there. But generally, some privacy, knowing that your identity won't be stolen, like that kind of privacy. is, I think, a right, but not necessarily one that's upheld. Um, freedom of expression is another right in the digital community. But again, there are limits and rules to everything.
Right.
Safety to a certain extent, I mean, or at least these are the ones that are near and dear to librarians, that we want to be considered rights that are respected and protected. I don't know.
I think safety is a big one. Like when in our physical communities, we expect to be safe, right? Like we have rules and norms to keep us safe while we're walking our dogs, while we're driving down the road, right? Like we have stoplights, we have things to keep us safe. And when we are online, we should be able to expect to be safe also. However, I think because we have talked about digital citizenship as something else for so long, that we have neglected a lot of things that might make us safe, like creating online norms, or norms for online discourse, or firewalls. Like we don't necessarily make sure that our computer technology is up to date, so all the firewalls are as non-holy as possible, right? Like we don't necessarily take care of those safety concerns, or we think of them as something other.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think sometimes this is probably true in the physical community as well, but you are so interested in just participating that we don't look at the fine print, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know that is true for me. And I think part of it is because, like Ms. SLU said, like, yes, I have certain expectations of privacy, but I also am like, well, if I'm going to do this thing, then like I'm already taking this level of risk. And so,
Right.
but like I admit to being somebody who like scrolls really quickly through the like user agreements and says yes, so that I can get on with the thing that I want to do, with maybe not paying as close attention to how is my information that I have now given this organization going to be used or not. And I think it's really easy for many of us just to be like, oh, well,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Well, and then the part of that is piggybacking on that. When you agree to the fine print with one tech company, and then it is bought by another tech company and the fine print changes, like you're not always aware of those changes, or you think, well, I agreed to this once, and you don't necessarily go back and revisit those privacy policies.
Right.
And
maybe, I mean, this I have very mixed feelings about this, as I'm sure you both do too. The governance of that digital world, do we need more and stricter, or will that take away some of the beauty and the creativity and the spontaneity and just the organic elements of the digital world? I'm truly cross sometimes, because in my opinion, because there are things that, I mean, it's only just recently that corporations have agreed to notify people that they use cookies, and it seems like a very silly thing, but it's a big thing, because it's like, what are this gets into the responsibilities. What are everybody else's responsibilities towards their users or their digital community? And we address that a lot as individuals, but we don't really have any kind of say over like corporations or organizations and how they should do that. So it's tricky. It's tricky to navigate.
Sure. Well, and that gets into a little bit of one of the other questions that you had, Ms. Meschter, was thinking about, like, from that organizational standpoint, like there are federal laws that impact various organizations, schools being one of them. So the two that you brought up earlier were FERPA and is it CIPA? Am I saying it right?
I say CIPA, but I mean, like, I think it's the same. So CIPA.
Yeah.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us what CIPA stands?
CIPA is the Children's Internet Privacy Act, and it's designed to
Protection Act. Yeah.
to protect children under the age of 18 online. And that's one of the things that's when teachers want a tech tool approved by the school district, that's one of the check marks that they have is, how does this meet CIPA guidelines? When we
specific for schools and libraries, is that correct?
Yes.
Those are the only two organizations that are impacted by this particular law.
Yep.
Okay.
And my former library that I used to work for was a public library, and we actually did not follow. I called it CIPA. It's probably CIPA. You know, we don't say anything right in Maryland, but it's true. But what a lot of people don't realize is it's monetized to a certain degree. If schools follow this, they get extra money from the government, and so do public libraries. And my library system turned down the money because they did not want to put any internet filters on our public computers, because we had a very diverse and not just, you know, culturally, but age group of users, and people would come in who don't have computers in their homes to look up health related issues, and certain tag words would block them if we, you know, like blocked certain anatomy parts because, ooh, they're naughty. But if you're looking up, you know, some form of cancer, you wouldn't be able to access the information. So we turned that down, which had its own complications, but also its own benefits. So it's very tricky.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think what people don't know is that, yes, CIPA is monetized. Like, there is like a financial carrot for making sure that you follow these protections, but that is why school districts usually have an acceptable use policy for. So that is part of my word soup, like what rules govern our behavior online is our AUP, so acceptable use policy. So these are the agreements that as a school district, we say we expect you to follow these things when using a device, regardless of what type of device it is. And as a user, you usually agree to those things in order to use the device. So,
and the AUP also, just to be more specific, also is not just school issued devices, it's the school issued network.
correct.
So if you are utilizing internet through the school, even if it's on a personal device of some kind, it's still connected to this agreement because it is your connection is school specific.
Yeah. Although CIPA does specify like that if an adult user needs to access something that they can't because of the school's network, there are opportunities to remove the barrier temporarily and put it back in place. So it's not, you know, like completely prohibitive of.
Sure. I'm just thinking that over the years, like I imagine, I haven't done the historical research to like back this up, but I imagine that our school district's AUP, acceptable use policy, has had to change and grow with the onset of more and more digital devices, right? Like when I first worked for the school district, lots of students didn't have phones that connected to the internet through a network, right? Very few students had personal computers. We didn't have one-to-one devices. We had, you know, a couple of building computer labs. And so like students' access to devices and to the internet in general were just much more limited. But in the last 15 years, that's just exploded, both through personal devices as well as what the school district is providing for students.
Right. Well, and especially with the pandemic, right? Like it's forced the issue for districts to be able to meet the needs of all of our students pre-K to 12. Like that's a huge, like public library concern with using internet, right? Like this is a huge population bandwidth. And when we think about access as being fundamental for digital citizenship, tech access is a major equity issue. It's an equity issue for pre-K to 12, for diverse, racially diverse and socioeconomically diverse communities, right? Like,
and like urban rural communities, which is not like our direct district impact, but like around the state of Washington, absolutely.
Yeah, and so like AUPs have to evolve, and I think sometimes we get into a clash where people don't realize what they're agreeing to, right? They don't read their fine print really well. and where people are saying, well, I really need this thing right now for this one project. And we're like, we need to slow down and do some more research, right? Like,
Right. Right.
so,
And I mean, the expectations for people of different ages, and I'm not saying that children and young adults don't have rights, but they are different, and that's something too that schools, and even my public library, we had children's computers that had
right.
a little more going on than the adult computers. We had young adults get on the adult computers, but because that's it's all about space and access. But this kind of reminds me, it takes me back to what we were talking about with responsibilities and that expectation of privacy again too. If you're using a school issued device, because we did have a few people in our school raise the question of Go Guardian and whether that was invasive or not, but you do have to follow the AUP. There are certain things that you are agreeing to by saying, yes, give me this, $400 device to use in my home. It's not yours, it's the school's. But it gives you access that we want you to have. But there are still certain rules attached to that access.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting thing. When I was looking this morning at I'm going to say CIPA, the Children's Internet Protection Act, it actually has sort of like 3 layers to it. There is the one, you as a school district or as a library agreeing to certain technological protection features, which is like the blocking and the filtering that happens. But it's also agreeing to educating your population about proper use of technology and like having safety policies in place. So like the AUP that districts develop, the acceptable use policy, comes directly out of that need. And then, we should be educating our students as well on like why certain rules are in place. How do we behave in the best of all possible ways in this digital world? And I think oftentimes we rely too much on the electronic protection features because in some ways that's simpler, right?
Right.
But then we get frustrated when they get in the way of something that we feel like is a legitimate like educational thing, right? So I think that's an interesting balance for educators to strike.
Yeah, and so like you brought up Go Guardian, Miss SL. So Go Guardian is one of those cases, I think, where we rely heavily on the tech filter or some sort of technology to do that monitoring, but it only is as effective as a student using a Chromebook logged in through the school, right? So like, if students are using their own devices, log in separately, then they start running into this, they can bypass Go Guardian.
And that's where the educational component is the most critical. And again, my former experience with the public library, we did not use any kind of net nanny or filter or anything like that, but we did have an acceptable use policy, and we actually had to be more vigilant about it because we didn't have any sort of fallback protections. And some libraries, school or public, they will actually make you agree each time you use one of their devices to the acceptable use policy. They'll like flash it up, and before you can go further you have to click I agree. And sometimes I wonder if we should remind people of that you agreed to this.
No, like I was at the doctor's office this morning, and while I was in the waiting room, I was checking my work email, and I had to agree to the hospital's acceptable use policy to go forward, even though I had just done that like a couple weeks ago, right? So every time, which is fine. Starbucks does the same thing, right? A lot of places with public internet, you have to agree every time. So education brings me to like my third question that I wanted people to think about. Digital citizenship is kind of in every set of core standards, but also not like explicitly digital, like it's not necessarily specifically called out outside of educational technology standards. If it is essential for setting up norms and expectations for an online community, and if this is part of our expectation for following CIPA regulations and acceptable use policies, where should we be teaching digital citizenship? where does this responsibility come from?
Okay, I'm grinning like a fool because I was so excited when I saw this question. Such a nerd. Because it should, we all know this. I'm not saying anything that you both don't already know and agree to. It should be taught everywhere. And there are standards, but, and in fact, a lot of people don't realize this, librarians fall kind of at the intersection of 3 sets of standards, because there's the, the national school library standards that are put out by the AASL. There's the future ready librarian standards, which are put out by Future Ready Schools. And then there's also ISTE, which, I know a lot of our CTE friends are very familiar with ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education. I have a little cheat sheet because I knew I would not get that right.
I'm just going to butt in for a second. In Washington State, our Washington State Ed Tech standards are taken directly from the ISTE standards. So if you're a Washington State educator and you don't know ISTE, but you know Washington State Ed Tech, they're the same.
They're the same. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, we have 3 sets of standards that kind of govern what we know students, well, everybody needs to be learning about technology and media literacy, and making that, and I'm so proud of Highline for kind of making the whole, media literacy standards more public and sort of combining some of these standards from these other 3 organizations, because people aren't aware of them, or aren't as aware of them as they should be, because there are standards and they do exist. This is dumb, I know, but can I share my screen for a minute? Because I totally all right, this, you hit on one of my things. So for my portfolio, this is so lame.
No, nerdy and exciting.
Nerdy and exciting. For my portfolio, for my library certification, my school library certification, I had to do sort of a cross of the new standards, or they were new when I did them,
Right.
and the Future Ready library standards. I couldn't work ISTE in because I just didn't have the room. And then the old ASL standards, which were basically the 5 roles: the teacher, the instructional partner, the information specialist, the program administrator, and the leader. So I made this sort of like, galaxy of connections, and I was like so proud of myself. And then I thought, well, that is a hot mess and nobody I know is going to be able to read that. But we need to show people that they exist and that they do overlap and connect, and they overlap and connect with every core subject area's standards as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
They're
And
not,
I think for me, that is the biggest challenge, right? Is that, we were talking off camera earlier about our district right now is going through an essential standards identification process in all of our departments, which is great. My concern is that if different departments are looking only at their department content standards, then some of these other types of standards that are more overarching don't necessarily get acknowledged in that work. And I think you're right in that these ed tech and media standards are applicable across the board, but they don't always find the light of day across the board. And so it seems like we need to figure out a better way system-wide. I think in our last video, Ms. McSheehy made a really good point that, like, in any class, anywhere, anytime a student is about to log into something electronically, there should be some sort of quick lesson around something related to digital citizenship or media literacy or something that is connected to what they're doing that day. But like, we should not allow students to be logging into a digital thing without acknowledging that. And I feel like that is a big piece that we're missing right now, that we have to find a way to spread it out system-wide.
Right. Like I was doing a deep dive again into the Common Core literacy standards, literacy and writing, well, language arts, literacy, writing, speaking, listening, language standards, right? That big set of standards. And while I think that many behaviors of digital citizenship are embedded throughout the writing standards, like when it's called out to behave ethically online, citing sources, things like that. I really actually think in many ways it lives in the speaking and listening standards, as these standards specify how to talk to each other, how to like use, yes, I acknowledge what you're saying, right? Like those sorts of skills. And I just keep thinking we need to be as explicit as with our physical discussion criteria as we are with our digital discussion criteria. Like those need to be so synthesized in the same way.
I agree.
Yeah.
I almost wish we could, and none of us have the time for this, but the Common Core state standards, we need to like turn it into a matrix where we can see the intersection of all the standards and sort of put it like a layer on top of it that's like, and here are all the media literacy standards that actually are part of this. But I it's a great idea in my head, and then the actual execution would just be a nightmare. I'm sure.
That's because it would be a three-dimensional matrix, like three-dimensional chess on Star Trek.
True.
But I agree. No, like, because, the C3 standards for social studies, they embed community and citizenship and how to behave and inquiry, right? Like all of the things that we emphasize as being part of digital citizenship are embedded throughout all of these core content area standards. And yet, when we all feel strapped by time and there's this calendar crunch, what gets taken away? That this is how to log in, this is where we expect you to go, this is what we expect you to do. We just assume students know it.
Right. Well, and the same thing is true ultimately for research as well. Like it takes time for students to effectively find their own sources. And when you're strapped for time, it's just easier to hand them the article yourself, right?
Right. Or Ms. Gunn, I think you alluded to this in the last podcast. Teachers default to the just Google it phrase that, we're all guilty of, but we also know it's not the best way to go.
Right.
I'm like, that phrase just like, I cringe.
But I do think, back to Kim, something you said earlier, I do think because of the pandemic and how much more time we've all been on digital devices and having to rely on things in the digital world, I do think this is more at the top of people's minds than perhaps it has been in the past. And so I think there has to be a way, again, system-wide, for us to sort of like harness that, like what different people in different places are seeing right now and like come together as a system, and not just as individual teachers or individual librarians or individual counselors being like, hi, over here, let's do this thing, right?
It has to be an integrated conversation. So on that note, we're almost out of time. So if you had one takeaway about digital citizenship that you would take back to tell colleagues, what would be your one takeaway? Mine would be, you don't have to do it alone. We could work together. Like that's my one.
I think that I really like what you were saying about looking at the standards through a different lens of like, where are we seeing things about community and conversation and engagement that we're not necessarily recognizing how those apply in a digital versus a physical world, and like broadening our viewpoint of that.
Oh, I just want to steal the ones that you guys said because they're awesome. I mean, because my takeaway always used to be, and I guess it's not really a takeaway, it's more like a drum I keep beating, is that that digital media literacy is not going away. This isn't a fad. It's not a trend. So let's all learn together, and let's not, kind of back to what you were saying, Ms. Meschter, let's collaborate because it's a big task. And the assumption about people being digital natives and the kids already knowing how to do all of this stuff just because they were born into a world that already had, you know, all of this technology is not true. And we've got to continually educate. You don't expect somebody to be born knowing math, because math has been around forever. So, you know.
Fair point.
Yes, nor do we expect students to know how to behave in a classroom setting, even though they've been in a classroom for years.
Yep.
As a senior or starting out, we are explicit every single time. And I think in the same way, we need to be explicit for digital environments.
Yeah, you got it.
All right, on that note, see you next week. Bye. Oh.